Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Taylor and Francis, we will be discussing data sharing trends and opportunities in the humanities and social sciences. When we think about research data sharing, we often default to the STEM disciplines. Frankly, so do the humanists to a degree. But that's why we're here, because there are actually many opportunities for the HSS disciplines to cross-pollinate with data sharing techniques. Funders, as they do for the sciences, are encouraging HSS researchers to share data, and publishers like Taylor and Francis are exploring ways to develop policies around data sharing practices as well. And libraries, with the research data services they provide for the sciences, are already well positioned to support these workflows for the humanities. Joining me to discuss this in a 4-episode series are Dr. Rebecca Taylor Grant, Head of Open Data Initiatives at Taylor and Francis, and Dr. Emily Farrell, Global Commercial Director, Open Research, also at Taylor and Francis. In this final episode of our series, we discuss the library's role in data sharing policies and specific areas where they can be most helpful. I really liked sort of hearing you talk about the emphasis you're putting on the library as a partner in sort of helping researchers with their, putting sharing data into their workflow. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that. Specifically, how can librarians act as a resource and advisor on data sharing policies and repository guidelines? What are some of the more specific areas where they can be helpful?
I think there's a tremendous amount that librarians can do, and we're already seeing that in certain institutions. For instance, Carnegie Mellon has a really amazing open science and data collaborations department in their library, and they've been really forward thinking in the ways that they support researchers in, not just the sort of written resources we've been talking about, but also in just having office hours where researchers can go and ask all sorts of wild and wonderful questions. And I think that's sort of I suppose, kind of the more traditional ways that researchers perhaps think of a publisher versus a library is that, as Rebecca said earlier, that we're often sort of the place they come to once they have their paper draft, and that's a long way after the data collection phase. Librarians,
Right.
on the other hand, have a chance to be able to, especially with library liaison roles where they're already connecting into the departments, they're working at a subject level, they can, they're often doing, I remember doing those sorts of resource trainings that the library would offer to classes and departments. And, well, this is how you find reliable resources. Here are some red flags and what you shouldn't be using. Don't cite Wikipedia. That sort of sounds basic type thing, but is worth reminding early career folks about. And I think that having that space to actually consider what it might mean to share your data before you even collect data. I think when I think about the book project that I was part of, we had all very much completely finished our research, had each done a PhD, had published articles out of our data, and then bringing it all together, it would have been a much less arduous process if we had just thought about some of the ways that we could unify that data, if we'd done that from the very beginning. And I think that there's some concern that would affect the way you approach a research project, but I think there are even small things like if you're working with data that needs to be transcribed, it's language data, that you think about a more unified way of the sorts of transcription conventions you use. And I think that is a really important role that the library can play in getting to researchers on campus even before they start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also think when it comes to kind of the support or guidance that a publisher can provide, we are quite focused on the policies that apply to our journals, whereas I think librarians are more aware of like the intersection of institutional and funder policies at the same time. And I think it's a concern that authors often have, that they are subject to multiple policies from multiple stakeholders, and that's not something that a journal editorial team can necessarily support them with. Whereas I think it's much more the role of the library and institution to give that kind of support.
Yep. Yeah, that's an excellent point. We've also seen some examples of academic libraries hiring researchers into the library and starting these innovative, service-oriented groups to support open science initiatives. For example, ensuring reproducibility and so on. Do you see like a sort of parallel to initiatives for HSS research?
No, I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that because there are, as we've talked about, there are so many different ways across humanities and social sciences that support is needed, that more kind of granular responses to individual questions about approaching data sharing in humanities and social sciences subjects. You really need that expertise, people that have gone through the process themselves, who are able to spend time thinking about the needs from these different discipline and subdisciplinary perspectives. If I had any say in library hiring, I would certainly recommend it. And I could see that there would be a really, beneficial, impact on how you could actually get the word out. And as Rebecca was saying, that's really part of the challenge. Is we can, create as many resources as you like, but leading people to those resources and working out how to get that level of engagement, that's the next step.
Mm-hmm.
I also think there's so much overlap when you're thinking about open research and data curation between the roles of librarians, what we call research data managers or data curators, also institutions hosting repository infrastructure. So there's kind of a space where all these things connected an institution, and I wouldn't want to say that this is not already happening. So I'm sure there's some very innovative projects happening in HSS data space that I might not be aware of, and some that I am.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So just, regarding, the importance of academic libraries in this role, how important is it, for them to take a leadership role in providing, data sharing services and support?
I think it's really important. Again, back to what we said, it's, we as publishers can pay, as much attention to it as we can, but we all sort of in the broader ecosystem and stakeholders need to sort of influence where we can, and libraries are filled with people that are really keenly aware of the pressures, the concerns around policy compliance, the issues around reproducibility and replicability as they apply to humanities and social sciences researchers. And I think there's, and around research integrity issues, there's so much that libraries are already doing. As Rebecca said, there's a lot of leadership there already, and I think just continuing that and the more we can work together, I think the better.
Mm-hmm. And as you said earlier, Emily, by the time a researcher is at the point where they're interacting with a publisher, they're already way downstream from, that original research workflow. So, yeah. Okay, excellent. That's all the time we have. Rebecca and Emily, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's always a pleasure.
You just heard from Dr. Rebecca Taylor Grant, Head of Open Data Initiatives at Taylor & Francis, and Dr. Emily Farrell, Global Commercial Director, Open Research, also at Taylor & Francis. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Taylor & Francis. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.